Hi, I'm Mike McGinnis, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Indiana University in Bloomington. I'm also a Senior Research Fellow and a former co-director at the Ostrom Workshop. This is the first of a series of videos on the concept of polycentric governance. Yes, I realize this term is an awkward construction and it may be a little off-putting to some, but it does a superb job of encapsulating the core concept at the heart of the Bloomington School of Political Economy or institutional analysis, whichever you've preferred. Now, I prepared a few PowerPoint slides to help lay out my argument. A printer-friendly version of these slides should be available on the Ostrom Workshop website. Polycentric governance, or PG for short, is an abstract and very complicated concept. Here I'll only be able to outline its basic meaning. Along the way, I'll mention topics covered in detail elsewhere, but I hope to give you a sense of just how powerful this concept can be, substantial enough to support the whole infrastructure of social science and policy analysis that is the Bloomington School. So what exactly is this cornerstone? Technically, it's a two-word phrase, with the first word, polycentric, serving as an adjective or adverb modifying the second word, governance, which makes it the more fundamental. So let's start with that second word, governance, which is typically thought of as an active process or a verb, but can also be an abstract thing or noun. There is no widely accepted definition of governance as an analytical concept, so I'll give you my best shot. Governance encompasses all the processes which determine the range of acceptable individual or collective choices available to members of the associated group or community. That may sound like a lot, and it is. There's a lot buried within that definition. Before digging deeper, it's worth a digression into what I mean by the terms collective choice or collective decision. The idea that an individual can make a decision is straightforward, but a collective decision is a more unfamiliar abstract concept. Members of a group must meet together or communicate via some other means to discuss their common situation and arrive at a consensus choice among the options available to them. Agreement is by no means the end of the story, not if that decision is meant to have a demonstrable effect. Groups will have to implement their decision by delegating the task to particular members or to outside agents who will act on their behalf. A critical next step is enforcement. The behavior of group members will need to be monitored and sanctions imposed on those who don't live up to the terms of their agreement. Finally, members will observe the effects of their action, compare it with what they hope to accomplish, reevaluate the situation, and if necessary, reconvene to reconsider the situation and maybe choose to try some other way to accomplish their shared goals. Clearly, successful collective action is no simple task, but the concept of governance takes this all to a higher level of abstraction and of complexity, because governance decisions are meant to determine which modes of collective action by which groups and others will be considered to be legitimate or acceptable or legal, and which modes of action require discouragement or even punishment. The scope of governance is broad. Governance decisions shape the options with which individuals, groups, and organizations will have available to them in future crises. Typically, groups who share some interests in common will also be pursuing their various private interests, and each group will be making decisions on a wide range of practical matters, many closely interconnected, in the sense that resolving one problem may help alleviate another problem, or it may make that problem worse, or have mixed effects on many other problems of ongoing concern. Community members are likely to bring multiple normative perspectives and social expectations to bear on their evaluations of current conditions and proposed solutions. And limits on their future options may turn out to have long-term consequences, perhaps leading to additional problems down the road, or providing citizens with expanded opportunities to cope with their emerging challenges. But this level of complexity need not be taken as a reason for despair. Since governance is itself a form of decision, collective decision, albeit at a very general and abstract level, we can invoke the same general sequence of steps: discussion, making a decision, implementation, enforcement, and reevaluation. An additional and very important twist is that the limits of choice imposed need not be restricted to the group making the decision. Far from it, actually, since one of the most appealing ways for members of one group to deal with a perceived threat is to work together to prevent another group from carrying out the harm they are threatening. As a consequence of this temptation to use one's control over processes of governance to unfairly restrict the actions available to others, attention must be paid to how this temptation can most effectively be controlled. Now, you may think I'm making this way more complicated than it needs to be, but I'm not. Governance can take many forms, as shown here. In self-governing groups or communities, the groups imposing the restrictions and the groups being restricted or empowered are mostly one and the same. In systems of representative democracy, the basic logic is that citizens elect representatives to make decisions regarding their governance, hopefully in ways that will serve both their personal interests and those of the public as a whole. But we must also allow for the possibility that governance can be imposed by domestic or foreign rulers with little reason to care what arrangements the targeted groups most prefer. Next, we must carefully distinguish governance from government. To many citizens, and unfortunately to many of my fellow political scientists, governance is simply what governments do. Well, governments do indeed do a lot of different things related to governance, but they don't do everything. In today's world, too many of us have a simplistic vision of governance as something that someone out there, the government or the state, does to us. But the Bloomington School vehemently denies that view. To paraphrase the renowned philosopher / cartoon character Pogo, we have met the government and they are us. The biggest step towards understanding the concept of polycentric governance is recognizing that governance involves many, many tasks, only a few of which we can safely leave in the hands of public officials alone. The rest of society also needs to be engaged, including executives and workers in private corporations, leaders, donors, and volunteers in nonprofit voluntary organizations, officers and members of professional associations, and influencers operating from the national level all the way down to community leaders and ordinary citizens. The diversity of actors involved in governance is clearly visible if you just look at the government itself. In fact, there really is no single thing that can be called the government. Instead, governments are complex networks of specialized public agencies, bureaus, councils, departments, legislatures, etc. Each unit has partial authority over certain matters, and the agents of different units are incentivized to pursue different goals. Many different kinds of government officials pass laws or write regulations, monitor compliance, adjudicate disputes, and enforce rulings by some form of sanctions. Other officials specify the duties assigned to particular offices and how individual office holders can be elected, appointed, promoted, or removed from office. Still, other authorities determine and oversee rules on how changes in rules, legal procedures, or constitutions can be proposed, debated, approved, and implemented, and who plays what kinds of roles at each step. But it's not just about the government. If you are all familiar with the way policy works in the US or in other advanced industrial democracies, then you know that many different kinds of non-public actors routinely play critical roles in the formation and implementation of laws, regulations, and other details of public policy. For example, private corporations and professional associations influence policy outcomes through campaign donations, lobbying, and advising regulators on how to regulate their own industries. Nonprofit organizations deliver public services through food banks, private schools, community health clinics, and many other types of organizations. And religious leaders often lead campaigns for political reform. All kinds of governance activities routinely involve individual and organizational participants, reaching well beyond the public agencies that have legal jurisdiction over such matters. Now, this slide summarizes the critical distinctions between government as organizational actors and governance as a multifaceted, complex processes. Formal and informal processes are deeply intermeshed throughout, and the range of institutional diversity can be quite spectacular. So let's put these pieces together to get an answer to the question I posed at the beginning of this talk, what is polycentric governance? First, governance involves many tasks requiring many different decision makers of different types. A government is indeed composed of many different pieces, each specializing in making decisions on specific tasks. And third, governance typically involves non-public as well as public organizations in completing those required tasks. Finally, since poly means many, the meaning of polycentric governance emerges naturally. A system of governance in which many centers of decision-making and authority are needed to cover the full range of governance tasks. But all this has just been the tip of the iceberg when it comes to complexity involved in polycentric governance. Before wrapping up this video, I'll give you a glimpse of what lies ahead should you decide to dig more deeply into the Bloomington School. As you can see here, the inclusion of public, private, voluntary, and community-based organizations and hybrid organizations is only one of at least 5 different dimensions of institutional diversity found in polycentric governance systems. And this slide by itself does not exhaust the full range of pieces that go into the full concept of polycentric governance, not by a long shot. I'd like to close this video by giving you a sense of the critical importance of polycentric governance to the Bloomington School and the broad scope of what it gives to those of us working within that tradition. First, polycentric governance offers us a way of describing processes of governance in operation in the real world by acknowledging and embracing their intrinsic complexity. Second, it provides a framework for our individual and collaborative research programs by directing our attention towards certain research questions and shaping our expectations. For example, we expect that most governance systems that have been resilient enough to remain in place for decades will have most and maybe all of the kinds of properties we associate with polycentric governance, like the complete list on the previous slide. Third, the components of polycentric governance as an analytical concept provide us with the building blocks for constructing and testing explanatory causal models of the performance of PG in different settings. Frankly, this is an area in which we need to do a lot more work. And fortunately, some very bright young scholars are engaged in exactly this project. Fourth, polycentric governance stands as a normative ideal, a mode of government that we have come to associate with securing both individual liberty and effective governance in pervasively multicultural societies that nonetheless continue to nurture a shared sense of their broader community. It also promises to enable governance systems to be more flexible in responding to changing circumstances, since it more effectively brings local information to bear on making appropriate adaptations to change. Fifth, the components that go into making a system of governance polycentric give us a rich menu of topics for consideration when we engage in our own policy analysis and advocacy in our own lives as citizens in the many communities within which each of us lives and works. As I noted earlier, governance is not something that happens to us, and we consider polycentric modes of governance to be the way we should work together with others in our own communities. Finally, polycentric governance is a major contributor to a general sense of shared optimism that the Ostroms instilled into the DNA of the Bloomington School. We're not Pollyannas, but thanks to their influence, we do tend to see politics primarily as shared problem solving rather than the struggles for domination emphasized in media or historical accounts. We also have a lot of faith that individuals and communities are much more capable of governing themselves than is generally realized. Whenever we encounter groups who don't have the resources they need to govern themselves effectively, then that's a problem we should try to help them fix. Understanding how all this works out in practice is a much longer story. If my talk has piqued your interest in learning more, I encourage you to watch the follow-up video entitled "A Few Key Examples, PG in Theory and Practice," in which I show how this polycentric governance concept has been fine-tuned to fit the different circumstances found in real-world settings and has guided much of the research conducted by scholars in the Bloomington School of Political Science or Institutional Analysis. Then check out my other videos and especially look at those those videos my colleagues had posted on the instructional resources page of the Ostrom Workshop website. We're still early in the process of posting instructional materials, so stay tuned for coming attractions. Now I'm pleased to inform you that because you have watched to the very end, you have now been officially welcomed into the wide, wild world of polycentric governance in the Bloomington School and beyond. I hope you enjoy the journey. Thank you.